All right, take it away.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Perspective's first Zoom conference titled Love, Land, and Leisure. My name is Dominic Sheehan, and I will be the moderator today. Before I get into the intro, I also want to just take care of some housekeeping. After each presenter, there's a virtual clap, so make sure to use that. There's a reaction button, so you can virtual clap for everybody. And then if you have questions, that'll be at the very end, once all the presenters are done. All right. This year's our journal had a record number of submissions for publication. Many articles were selected to represent Cal State LA's 75th anniversary, but 3 articles in particular stood out and needed to be explored in this conference. So our first presenter is Chris Gurrola. He is a master's student whose research interests include urban LA, 19th century California history, and world history in relation to pre-modern identities. His presentation will be discussing gender and sexuality in modern China. Our second presenter will be Tyler Lyon, who also is a current master's student. His research interests are political history and state building in the Western Hemisphere post-1800. He will be talking about 19th century Whittier's agriculture and mining labor forces. And finally, our last presenter, Anna Galvan. She graduated from Cal State LA in 2021. Her research interests are social, political, film, and media history, along with 18th century European history. Her presentation is on the legacy of feminist fashion in the 20th century America. Now, without further ado, our first presenter, Chris Gurrola.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dominic, for that intro. And so I'm excited to be here with everyone tonight and to be able to present my research and my presentation. So, 1 second. So my presentation is titled Non-Hegemonic Gender and Sexuality Activism in Modern China. And my presentation will focus on the emergence of queer identities and activism in China during the 1990s. I will also be making mention of how certain actions by the CCP and Xi Jinping have impacted queer communities and activism in China today. So to start off my presentation, I'm going to be talking about some historical examples of same-sex relationships during China's imperial period. I want to point out that in classical Chinese language, they had no word to identify a person who engaged in same-sex sexual activities. Therefore, same-sex behaviors were not tied to a person's identity. And this meant that there was no set sexual preferences. Same-sex desires were seen as normal and embraced by emperors, bureaucrats, and people of various classes. And as you can see here, I have some examples from various dynasties. For example, during the Western Han Dynasty, 10 out of 11 emperors were described to have favorites, which were male lovers. They also engaged in same-sex relationships with palace eunuchs. Another example is the Qing Dynasty. Qing emperors engaged in same-sex relationships with subordinates. And while my dynasty examples focus more on male same-sexual activity, the mirror rubbing gang, Mo Jingdang from 19th century Shanghai, is an example of female same-sex relationships and examples of sexual activity between women. It composed of wealthy widows and mistresses of wealthy men. They were recognized for forming communal bonds based on their sexual experiences, and many of their stories were found in early historical writings of Shanghai. Moving on, we'll talk more about the historical developments during the 20th century in China. So during the early 20th century in China, Western medical sexology gained prominence from the Western world. This meant concepts of homosexuality associated with mental illness and sexual perversion were introduced into China. Another big development was that a translation for homosexual was introduced into China, which was Tongxing Lyon. And this restructured the way people viewed same-sex behaviors and relations, more on a binary, such as homosexuality and heterosexuality, which was not common in China during its ancient and imperial periods. And also, Tongxing Lyon would be associated with negative medical terms, and this would play a big impact in the way queer individuals in China were identified is specifically through negative medical terms. Some other big developments were the economic reforms and opening up of China during the late 1970s. This led to expanded individual freedom. This also meant that people were able to find job opportunities in urban areas and leave their more rural towns. Another huge development was in 1995, the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. This introduced NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations, as a form of activism for feminists and queer individuals in China. And this would be the spearhead for a lot of activism between both groups. Another major development was the removal of hooliganism as a crime from Chinese criminal law in 1997. During the 1980s, a lot of queer people were still targeted under this law, and many during the Mao era were put into labor camps for being caught engaging in same-sex behaviors. Huge development as well was in 2001, when homosexuality was no longer considered a mental illness by the Chinese Psychiatry Association, and this would play a big part in allowing people to embrace their queerness and it no longer being associated with these negative medical terms. This leads me to the development of the Tongzi and Lala identities, which are central to my presentation and the research I did. So Tongzi pretty much translates to comrade in English and was used by the Chinese Communist Party as a revolutionary term. However, 1989 in Hong Kong at the Lesbian Hong Kong Gay Film Festival, it was used in a new form to identify gay men. And this helped gay Chinese men identify themselves separately from international gay identities. Another huge development was the introduction of the Lala identity, which was the Chinese lesbian woman identification of themselves. This also came from Hong Kong. And during this period, Hong Kong and Taiwan were huge sources of inspiration for the Lala community in China due to convenience of language and proximity of the region. So this leads me to some early Tongzi and Lala activism, especially with the outbreak of HIV and AIDS in China and the soaring of cases. The CCP started to take this disease more seriously. So this led to public health activists reaching out to queer activists, and they were some of the first to form ways of working with the queer community, and they brought attention to the Tongzi community that wasn't present before. Another major development was Tongzi and Lala parties, get-togethers in bars and private homes. These tended to occur in the homes of foreign activists. They were in China due to having more privacy and allowing Chinese individuals that were still in the closet to not have to host get-togethers in their homes, or it might have a big part in forcing them to come out. The internet was another huge development for activism between the Tongzi and Lala communities, as they were able to connect to international queer individuals through chat rooms. They were also exposed to queer media, especially from the United States. The Stonewall riots were one of the major influences in China, and they really embraced its message. And in a lot of early accounts of activism, they referenced Stonewall. Another major development was in 1997 in Beijing, the men's and women's pager hotline. This provided anonymous free counseling in a more discreet manner, where closeted individuals could call in and talk to more experienced queer members. And this also allowed them to organize and publicize events. And also in 2009, the first Shanghai Pride, it was one of the first major events in China where queer individuals could go and embrace their queer identity out in the open and kind of embrace their identity. And it also became a space for queer activism. So there was major differences between Tongzi and Lala activism, however. During the mid-1990s, the Chinese government began to work towards preventing and lowering rates of HIV and AIDS. This led to them embracing Tongzi NGOs who were advocating for HIV and AIDS prevention, which allowed them to gain vast support from the government. This tied Tongzi NGOs to public health initiatives of the state. However, Lala NGOs were excluded from obtaining the same type of state resources and support. This also allowed Tongzi NGOs to develop strategic partnerships with the government. However, this limited how they could challenge the government and really determine the type of work they did when partnering with the government. Lala NGOs, on the other hand, had to focus more on human rights issues, and this was considered a politically sensitive topic by the CCP and local governments. They also struggled to access funding since they couldn't work with the government like Tongzi NGOs could. This meant that they had to reach out for foreign funding, and with their transnational um, connections, and that meant they had to be well versed in English and human rights knowledge, and this also meant they were easier targets for the government to target, especially with the type of work they were doing with international groups. Lala activists and leaders had to be educated in feminist queer theories and rights rhetoric, and this would lead to tension between Tongzi activists and Lala activists, as Tongzi activists lacked this gender perspective due to being more dependent on the CCP and local governments, while Lala NGOs had to get involved in this more elitist form of activism and trying to get funding for their NGOs. And that really set different trajectories of the activism between Tongzi and Lala groups. And then a huge development that recently has happened and has impacted the way Tongzi and Lala NGOs are continuing to shape their activism is the 2017 Foreign NGO Management Law. So this law has given more power to the government in identifying foreign NGOs and domestic NGOs with foreign funding. This is part of Xi Jinping's and the CCP's tightening of their control over China's civil society, and it's meant to control foreign influence on activist groups in China. This has impacted domestic NGOs with transnational ties and the ones that rely on foreign funding. This means that foreign NGOs cannot endanger China's national security or national interests, and can also not engage in or fund for-profit political activities. LGBT NGOs also lack official recognition if they're not able to gain the approval of the government. And this means they have to register as commercial enterprises. And if they're not able to get approval, or they continue working with unregistered international organizations, they face legal punishment if they are found of illegal activities. And then now I'm going to talk about more recent developments that have happened the last couple of years that have also been caused through similar actions by the government. So one major impact was the arrest of the Feminist Five in 2015. They were arrested for planning a protest on International Women's Day, and they're going to distribute anti-sexual harassment stickers on public transportation. Shanghai Pride was shut down in 2020, and this was a big blow to the queer community in China. And recently at two Chinese universities, LGBT groups had their WeChat social media accounts shut down, which also happened to LGBTQ NGOs. And a really anonymous development was at Shanghai University, where a campus survey was spread out that specifically asked for information on LGBTQ students and asked for information on their state of mind and psychological conditions, also their political stance and social contacts. So with these recent actions by the CCP, what does this mean for activism, queer activism in China? The different forms of activism between Tongzi and Lala activists gives us an idea of what type of activism is accepted by the CCP and what is not. Tongzi activism is given more political space due to its focus on HIV/AIDS prevention, while Lala NGOs focus on human rights issues and are considered more politically sensitive due to their activism. And it will be interesting to see if Tongzi and Lala activism continues along these separate trajectories, or if they will find a common ground to support one another against the CCP's suppressive actions. And while it might not be clear to myself after doing this research what direction it will go into, these developments give us a better idea of how they're going to have to shift their activism around, and the activism is going to have to find, between Tongzi and Lala activists are going to have to find some common ground if they both want to survive, due to examples of suppression that have been happening. And that covers my research, and it's been a pleasure and I'm thankful for being able to share with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that presentation. Very well done. Next up is Tyler Lyon.
Hi, so I'm Tyler Lyon, and I'm going to be talking about mining and agriculture in the Sacramento River Valley. I am predominantly talking about the late 19th century, though there is some bleed over into the early 20th. And this is also very much a history of rivers and how both of these industries interacted with the world around them. In particular, looking at specifically hydraulic mining and how hydraulic mining practices damaged rivers in the Sacramento River Valley, the negative impact that the flooding had on agricultural development, and finally, the lasting damage to the rivers themselves. This damage is what carries on into the 20th century and is really the legacy of mining in the Sacramento Valley. In the late 19th century, California is still very much changing population-wise as immigration is increasing. This population density map from 1880 does show a growing population in the Sacramento River Valley here. It is not the most populous region in the state, but it is very much growing alongside these rivers. It is developing more and more specifically after 1870 and becomes a real battleground between these two industries. Looking at the workforce, in 1860, shown here in blue, the total workforce was around 219,000 workers of those who reported their profession on the census. Of that, about 83,000 were miners, compared to around 31,000 agricultural workers. These do include not only the miners and farmers themselves, but all adjacent industries. By 1880, however, there is a major shift. The workforce increases by about 50% to around 375,000. Miners have seen their jobs reduced in half, down to 37,000, while agricultural workers have over doubled to 67,000. There is this major shift towards agricultural workers at this point, yet it is still not considered the dominant industry. A large part of this, we have to look at the rivers themselves. So river map of the Sacramento River Valley, and there are a lot. And they all feed into the Central River, the Sacramento. There are two regions that are of particular note. The Sierra Nevadas, where most mining companies operated, and Huda Creek, which was home to some of the biggest agricultural projects in Northern California at this time. Looking at the Sierra Nevadas, after the gold rush, hydraulic mining rose to the fore. This involved blasting material out of the mountains with high-powered water, and as a result, this left behind a lot of debris. The sediment and gravel that was left behind would be washed away by the water and by the yearly rains into a lot of these smaller rivers coming down from the mountains. Mining companies did not really have any reason to prevent this. It would have been expensive, and quite frankly, there was no legal precedent stopping them from washing away the debris from the mountains into the rivers. Of course, these smaller rivers feed into the larger ones, specifically the Feather, the Yuba, and the American, which do flow into the Sacramento River in the center. Talking about Huda Creek, this was described in 1860 as the richest cereal district in California by the Daily Alta California, a San Francisco newspaper, despite the fact that this land wasn't particularly developed. This was due a lot to land disputes between US settlers, treaty citizens from Mexico, and squatters. But on top of this, developing the land was incredibly difficult. Starting in 1862, there are major floods in Northern California. 1862 is dubbed the Great Flood, which has the Sacramento River overflowing, which does overflow into Poudre Creek and destroys a lot of the wheat crop. 3 years later, in 1865, there is another flood that is several feet higher. What's most remarkable about these floods is that they are buried in newspapers the more time goes on. These become very regular occurrences for farmers. The problem is as they are trying to grow specifically wheat, the floods would destroy their crops, damage their buildings and their equipment, and they would have to rebuild from the land up. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, these floods get worse. Further upstream, in 1875, one resident of Marysville near Yuba City, William Ellis, describes watching the rush of waters down the Yuba River, carrying with it some barns, small houses, several cows, and particularly a side of barn with a lot of chickens on it. This was carrying away people's property and their livestock, leaving them very little to build off of. By the time we get to the later 1870s, many farmers and associated industries are in debt. William Dresbaugh, who was shipping grain down the Sacramento River, ended up $1.5 million in debt in 1878 due to damage to the rivers, destroying his boats. One man, R.S. Carey, who had the great misfortune of only planting during the years that there were floods, ended up killing himself because his debts grew so high. This becomes a bigger problem, and there isn't really any change until 1884 with the court case Woodruff v. North Bloomfield Mining Company. In what is dubbed the Sawyer decision, which is released 2 years later, it is decided that mining companies are liable for any damages caused by the sediment that is being offloaded into these rivers, including floods. More importantly, Sawyer decides that farmers and landowners can sue mining companies en masse, saying that if they had to go company by company, it would create a burden so impractical and onerous as to amount to an absolute denial of justice. This does lead to a decline in mining. It does become more expensive to operate. And as a result, mining as an industry really starts to die in the 1890s. For a final area, we come to Marysville, which is right across the Feather River from Yuba City, in between the Feather and Yuba rivers. And particular resident, William Turner Ellis. Ellis was a member of the Marysville Levee Commission, oversaw many of these developments meant to prevent flooding in the Sacramento River Valley, and very remarkably, provided about 50 years of water readings of the Yuba River. I have graphed them out here, with the blue being the high water readings and the orange being the low water readings in any given year. From 1880 into about 1907, there is a steady increase in that lowest water reading. This is a result of increased sediment in the bottom of rivers and just more problems upstream that are causing high water downstream. This is continuing about 10 years after mining really starts phasing out and is very indicative of that lasting damage. At the same time, we see those high water rising much of the same way. It's a little bit more fluid between the high and lows on those highest water readings, but there are still continuous floods with usually only 1 or 2 years passing in between major flood events. After about 1907, however, we do see a decline in those lowest water readings, and a large part of this has to do with improvements, building levees, rerouting rivers, and clearing out the bottom of riverbeds. However, these high water readings are still very erratic. The highest water reading we get is in 1927, over 20 years after the low water readings start declining. Floods very much remain a risk, and Ellis notes in his memoirs that he writes in 1936 that the 1937 flood is going to be something that is far worse than anything before because they have not been keeping up with reclamation projects. Of course, the highest water readings come before he publishes, and he is wrong. But there is still that lasting fear. And he still believed that the worst was yet to come. This is the legacy of mining. The rivers are very much still damaged 20 and 30 years after hydraulic mining ceases. And there is very little sign that it was an easy fix. Millions were invested in these rivers to try to repair them. And yet at the end of these readings, we still see high water levels. We still see floods. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Tyler. As someone from Sacramento, and it's always nice to hear more about the city I grew up in. Up next, and our final presenter, Anna.
All right, let me just go ahead and share my screen. Start broadcast. All right. So hi, my name is Anna, and so I'm gonna go ahead and start. Clothing is oftentimes associated with social status, not the clothes itself, but the brands. Like today, we associate brands like Dior, Prada, and Balenciaga with money. The same way we associate them with money today, fashion trends in the early 1900s did the same because it was unattainable. Today, I will be presenting my research paper titled Fashion and Femininity. The research provided will discuss why fashion and its consumption contributes to leisure rather than it does labor. Through the division it caused within social classes, rise of ready-to-wear fashion, use of fashion magazines, and including wartime activity and its impact. The use of fashion can indicate the division in society. Despite the division, fashion can also bring people together through its sense of agency. The information I gathered is based on the United States during the years 1900 to 1918, with specific examples from New York. Many historians argue that the beginning of the 20th century brought little change to women's fashion, as it didn't noticeably change till the mid-1910s. But something that did drastically change was consumerism. The way in which people bought clothing changed from buying textiles in order to make their own pieces of clothing to stepping into department stores and being able to buy ready-to-wear fashion pieces of clothing. However, this was not true for everyone. Those with the luxury of having money were able to spend it on ready-to-wear garments, while those who were lacking the funds continued with their previous dressmaking activities. In the dresses themselves, you can see that there's a little bit of a change, starting with the beginning being 1905 to the last picture being from about 1917. They start with a little bit of an S shape, going into a little bit more of a loose fitting silhouette. In a way, they kind of dropped these big dresses from the previous century in exchange for bigger hats and gloves and scarves. Ready to wear is defined as clothes that are made in standard sizes so that they fit most people rather than being made specifically for a particular person. With the rise of new technology constantly being produced, there are inventions such as a sewing machine created in 1846 that made it easier to piece together these textiles instead of doing it by hand. Something else that made it a little bit more easy to get clothing was the rise of department stores. Department stores allowed for people to go in and buy their clothing pieces that are already made, hence ready to wear clothing. This is just one way in which fashion became a little bit more accessible to people, but another way was because these department stores were creating replicas of high-end clothing. Again, making it a little bit more accessible to people who couldn't afford these really expensive designs. So the gap between the lower and the upper class. Although on the surface, ready-to-wear fashion seems to be more accessible, it still caused a gap between social classes, as there were still lower classes and working class women having to modify their clothing in order to somewhat stay with the trend. High society women were exposed to these trends and could easily participate because they had the funds to do so, while also still being able to have their own custom pieces of clothing. On the other hand, lower and working class women opted towards hand-me-downs because they lacked the financial resources to buy these new garments. Here, there's a picture of women working in a sweatshop in New York in 1908. So something that stands out is how it's all uniform. And even though the dresses look a little bit different, for the women on the left side, they're still similar. And then their hair is tucked away from their faces and just how they're all working together in comparison to this picture of women of upper class society in 1910 in New York as well. Something that automatically stands out are the accessories, the scarves that look like they have a little bit of an animal's face on the end, and the hats that are big and have a lot of bows and flowers. That's something that I meant when they left behind the extravagant dresses of the past and changed them for scarves and hats. So fashion magazines bonded women together by getting ready to read the latest issue and seeing what's trending or what questions being asked in the advice column. Yet at the same time, these magazines were also at fault for creating the division. They had a clear audience of being for housewives and for rich women and women who didn't work. These magazines had a clear audience. They catered specifically to these women with their articles titled "Why Women Aren't Moneymakers" or "Questions for the Pretty Girl," and providing articles describing why women should just not work in general. However, in the midst of this, there were still some pieces describing how women can make clothing on a budget and they could stay on the trends. So who were these fashion trendsetters? Obviously, the trendsetters were rich women who were able to buy these extravagant pieces and the designers creating them. But there's also some credit to give to those who are publishing and creating articles and being the editors for these magazines. Interestingly enough, most of these editors were men, with only Vogue having women, female editors. So back to what I had previously mentioned about the articles of staying on a budget while still being able to stay in fashion trends, those came from Vogue, not from the other articles, not from the other magazines like Good Housekeeping, Ladies Home Journal, and so on. Here are a few examples of some fashion magazine covers. So, wartime fashion. France has always been a pioneer when it comes to fashion. So for the First World War, when they had to take a step back, this allowed for places such as New York City to become influential to fashion. Clothing became less extravagant in order to match the events that were occurring during this era, becoming more utilitarian and practical, losing the extravagant accessories that we saw during the previous and earlier decade. Silhouettes began to noticeably change too, as we can go back to that first picture that I originally showed. They started losing that S shape and became a little bit more loose fitting, and it became less of a competition for women. It was more of an afterthought. Upper class women who were not used to this sort of lifestyle sort of got a glimpse as to how it was for lower class women who did not have access to these closets filled with clothing. While the First World War did impact a lot of fashion, it wasn't until post-war where a lot of fashion started to change and we get those looks like from the 1920s. But here are some Vogue covers and in which they show the support of France. So the first one being from November 1st, 1917, saying Vive la France, and it translates into Long Live France, demonstrating their support for France. The next being from June 15, 1918, and it shows a woman waving a white flag, which we know as being someone calling to surrender. And under that, there's a France flag, a United States flag, and a United Kingdom flag. This could mean that she is, or the person illustrating this and who drew it, is calling for an end to the war. And then the next being from November 15th, 1918, it says Le Cœur de France, or La France, which translates into the heart of France, meaning that despite everything that happened, France was still able to persevere and continue through these hard times that they were faced with. So fashion and leisure or fashion and labor. Fashion falls under the leisure category because it provides people with a sense of identity, whether it's with women setting and following these fashion trends or getting together to read about these fashion trends in magazines. Fashion creates a community based on conversation and competition. Fashion creates a sense of identity and agency, allowing for women to use these places, use their pieces of clothes as their words. Depending on what perspective you're looking at, fashion can fit under both, but for this case, it fits under leisure. So fashion in the past versus fashion today. We see these trends from the past constantly coming back in different variants. We take inspirations and contribute them into what's currently popular. Currently, there's a rise of fashion consumerism that's based off of fast fashion, which is basically just a little bit of a thread of ready-to-wear fashion. This trend only is supported through the rise of celebrity and influencer culture that we see today, see all over our social media like TikTok and Instagram and so on. In short, these fashion trends are interesting to look at because they always reflect the time period that's being observed. So right now, probably 10 years from now, we'll see what's popular now in just another format. Thank you. I do not know how to close my screen.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And if we want to just give one more round of applause to all our presenters for those great presentations. Thank you very much to all of you. Now we will be getting into the questions portion of the conference. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat or you can raise their hand and we'll give you the floor. So the first person that will be taking questions is Chris.
All right, yeah, I got one for you, Chris. Let's see, you mentioned in 2001 that it was no longer considered a mental illness to be homosexual, no longer considered legally. Did they have in China their version of gay conversion therapy that we see out here in the West? Did you catch any examples of that?
Not that I know of. I'm not too sure, but from what I do know and what the sources I read, in China, there's a lot of, pressure to, fill these masculine roles, especially for men. They have to fill that role in the family. They have to continue the lineage. They have to, get married at a certain age. They have to have children for the grandparents. They have to take care of their parents. So I'm not too sure about with conversion therapy. I'm pretty sure there's examples of that. Not that I came across it, but there was this huge societal pressure, and there still is today, for people that are not heterosexuals and, were queer individuals. For example, there was instances of closeted men where they were outed or they started embracing their identity more. And some of their wives committed suicide, and they were blamed for the suicide of their wives, and their wives were presented as victims in the media, and a lot of times they were like criminalized, and they were blamed for embracing their queer identity. And the societal pressure in China is so different compared to the United States or other countries. And that's why it was so important for them to have this Tongzi identity. You know, they experience different things from international queer identities, and you know, they deal with a lot of societal pressure. And that's why the Tongzi activists and their collaboration with the government, they can't really embrace femininity. You know, they have to embrace this masculinity in their activism and what they do. And that's why in China still, even within the Tongzi community, there's still a lot of discrimination against femininity, and you know, people that are not this normalized typical masculine role of what men should be.
Thanks.
Thanks for kicking off the questions, Joshua. I believe Matthew, you had a question?
Yeah, hi. So I know early on in your presentation, you mentioned the ancient society or the ancient dynasties or the earlier on dynasties that were practicing in the same sex in regards to male portions of it. I had a question in regards to that. So it's kind of well known that the Greeks and the Romans had, you know, these same-sex parties, the same-sex orgies that you, whatever you call them. Did you find any evidence of those actually happening too within the Chinese dynasties as well?
Not exactly like erotic orgies in that way, but there is examples of eroticism within and you know, more of the bureaucratic upper classes in ancient and imperial China. For example, there was instances in certain dynasties, I believe the Ming dynasty, where emperors and upper class bureaucrats were really interested in male actors that would culturally perform for people of the upper class, and they would have relationships with these male actors, and it was popularized to have a relationship with a popular male actor. And male actors were eroticized by people of the upper classes, and it was prominent in a lot of their literature and a lot of their society. It kind of, you know, allowed them to gain more respect from people, you know, if they were engaging with like a popular male actor of the time. And it was considered like I guess you could say like a sophisticated cultural custom to be engaging, you know, in these type of relationships. So, and I didn't really come across a lot of like orgy type of things, but there were instances where you know, emperors or people from the upper classes would be engaging in these sexual relationships with people that were popular for the times.
Thank you for that question, Matthew. I believe Dylan, you had a question?
Yeah, great research and presentation, Chris. Great job. I just had a really question about, you know, this is more of a contemporary issue. So I'm wondering, you know, what it was like working with foreign language sources in this context, or did you run into any obstacles in that regard, because it is more contemporary and, you know, in the age of the internet, there are more ample opportunities to have translations readily available for you. So yeah, I'm just curious if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you. I worked on this with Dr. Yao, and she was very helpful if, you know, I needed translations for anything. But I think it was a benefit to be able to do more contemporary research, because now like Twitter was a big help. Like, you know, a lot of activists, people with connections in China, with activists in China, they would, you know, give more English interpretations of what was going on with the government suppression and with certain activists or certain groups. So, you know, I was able to benefit, you know, by looking through Twitter and seeing how these suppressive tactics by the CCP were affecting certain groups and the activism, but also the media. I think definitely there was, you know, the American media was heavily interested in what was going on in China right now. So a lot of American media covered a lot of things too that were going on, specifically with the LGBTQ groups and colleges and the NGOs. And I just think right now there's a lot of international focus on what the CCP is doing, specifically with the queer community. So that was a benefit to me. But yeah, there were instances where I came across websites where, you know, I needed translations with certain things. So luckily I was able to, you know, look around and find more American media sources that talked about the same things. But, you know, just looking through more Chinese, like sources from China, and trying to find similar news accounts from the US. That was how I was able to do this research.
Good question, Dylan. I believe Joel, you have a question?
Yeah, hi there. Also, yeah, great presentation. I definitely appreciate the transnational aspect of it, and especially as you know, parallels are drawn between the two large nations and what have you. My question is regarding also kind of imperialist era, right? So I know that in the Americas, two-spirited, non-gender binary folks were often attributed with supernatural characteristics, i.e., witches, shapeshifters, and a lot of these people were persecuted because of this. I wonder, did you find any of that supernatural, pacts with the devil, anything like that, within the literature in the imperialist China?
Great question as well. No, I was not able to come across anything of that. I believe, there was, examples of that, but what I came across more of was more like ancient poetic metaphors of same-sex relationships and behaviors. Nothing exactly having to do with, mystic things like that. One thing that I did come across similar to that, though, is in China and Imperial Chinese medical knowledge. They didn't really gender the body. They considered individuals and their bodies to consist of both male and female aspects. So they didn't really define their bodies, like how we view them today, like male, female. Everybody in the imperial period was considered to have a kind of a mixture of both. So not necessarily I didn't come across things like that, but I came across certain, aspects where they mentioned how there was fluidity, how they viewed the body, how it was interpreted, and there was not really any defined sexual identities. But yeah, I'm pretty sure there was things like that, but unfortunately I was not able to come across any particular examples.
Actually, I just have a little bit of a follow-up question on that. So was that rooted in like the duality of religion? Is that like where the medical aspect of that came from?
I guess you can kind of say, yeah, it was like Confucius aspects. Confucianism is integral to Chinese history, and especially its imperial past. While it was not really clear to me, exactly how they interpreted it completely. It did make mention of the yin and the yang, how, that's central to Chinese, ancient imperial history. And it did make mention of the yin and the yang and aspects of that, and just the fluidity of how they viewed certain things. But I'm not quite too clear on that, or really came across anything that really emphasized that.
All right. Thank you, Joel. Is there any other questions for Chris? Yes, Jerry.
Hi, Chris. What caught my ear was this kind of different government. What I heard anyway, maybe I was wrong, was this different governmental response between the Tongzi and the Lala in the late 20th century, when they were beginning to, I guess, tacitly accept what was going on. It seemed from the presentation that this was kind of a policy-driven difference between the two. The Tongzi were more focused on the HIV/AIDS, but I was wondering if it was really more of a gendered response within Chinese society that was affecting that, or perhaps it was both. I don't know what. That I'd like you to speak to that particular point. Why was there this different governmental response to the two groups?
Oh, yeah, great question, Jerry. Thank you. It definitely was both. In China today, like filial piety especially with this, the gendered roles between males and females. Females, especially in the imperial history, that's always so difficult for me to find examples of same-sex relationships or behaviors with women, because it wasn't really recorded in their histories. There was more of this attention to male behaviors and more aspects of what males were engaging in, but they didn't really take women into account, because with filial piety and the integral role of men to the family, females were just seen as benefiting the male and the family, and not really identified as like individuals, and that definitely continued into the 1990s, and especially under the Mao era, where women were more accepted equally to men, but they were still seen by the state to fulfill a purpose, and that purpose was to provide children for the state at the end of the day. And this tended to have an impact when LGBTQ communities like the Tangsin and the Lala started to form. And especially women are in China today are still pressured to get married by a certain age. They're expected to have children by a certain age, and this definitely played a big part too in the trajectory of their activism as well. At the end of the day, China, is under an authoritative government, and Xi Jinping is really trying to drive these, gendered identities that are integral to the state. And this tends to benefit men at the end of the day. They kind of have that gendered benefit, and women, they're they still have to deal with this. And that's why with their human rights discourse and having to align themselves with more feminist activists, more non-gendered activists, it's because of the societal pressures of China. And while I could have made it more clear in my presentation, I wish I could have, but it definitely did come across a lot in my research, and it was definitely something that you have to take into account when looking at how they are treated by the government.
Thank you very much for that question, Jerry. Is there anyone else who has a question for Chris? If not, thank you, Chris. Phenomenal research, great presentation. Give it up for him one more time. And now I will open the floor to Tyler for anyone who has questions for him. Yes, Matthew.
Sweet, I get to go first again. Great presentation. I had a question. So I know, Tyler, you're doing your research predominantly on the late 19th century, which is right around the time when the post-Civil War and the creations of the transcontinental railroads and the real big push for the railway system. Did you find in your research that any of these floods caused by the mining industry really put any dampers or delays within, onto the construction of these railroads?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I would argue that the creation of the railroads added additional pressures onto farmers more than the floods damaging the railroads. When agriculture was really growing in the 1870s, the country wasn't super connected. But once we get to the later parts of the 1880s and 1890s, this really causes the wheat market to drop out in California. And there's this big kind of chaos as farmers try to switch over to other crops. There is a big push for orchards in Putah Creek. One farm actually goes for silk. And the logic being that minor floods would not damage the orchards as much. Of course, this comes with additional labor costs, where wheat fields, you could go in with a thresher. You can't do that with a field that there is so much more manpower that goes into it. And in the case of a major flood, if you lose a tree, that is far worse than losing part of your wheat field, because it takes several years for a tree to become viable. So I think especially becoming more connected transportation wise, that was more of an additional pressure on farmers. Fortunately, there didn't seem to be too much damage from floods on that.
Thank you for your question, Matthew. Joshua?
Yeah, so I was reading just this morning, actually, that LA area is going back into major drought territory. And I was wondering if you were seeing at all the footprints of this old mining industrial waste come back to haunt us in any way, or if this is just based entirely off of consumption, which I would understand.
That's great. Absolutely. In the aftermath of a lot of this flooding, we do see efforts to control river flow. Some 300,000 acres in the Sacramento Valley are dedicated to being floodplains. They erect levees just to prevent a lot of this damage. By the time that Ellis gives his warning in 1936, a lot of that has been reclaimed, which was a very expensive act. So there is that recovery from just rebuilding the land. But a very important part of this is as they are removing a lot of those floodplains and focusing it on smaller and smaller areas, that has a very negative effect on groundwater. There is a lower surface area for that to get absorbed back in. And as the mining waste was also kind of lowering the quality of rivers, there was a greater reliance on groundwater. So it's this double-edged sword where it is very much worsening those conditions that make us more reliant on heavy rainflow years. I think we are very much seeing the effect of that in the past decade with how low a lot of the underground aquifers have gotten. And a large part of that has to be with how we reacted in the post-mining years.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Great question, Joshua. Appreciate it. Joel, you have a question?
Yeah, my question was around, I know that during the gold rush, first of all, I just wanted to say, I really appreciate your enthusiasm that you bring to the table, because Zoom calls can be kind of dry sometimes. And I apologize for not having my camera on. But anyways, I know that the mining kind of brought a lot of labor that was targeted towards mining vis-a-vis like Mexican miners that were bringing silver up, moved and migrated to California, and other folks as well. I wonder, was there a connection between, farmers or agriculture workers leaving, Jim Crow South? Did that affect the upswing of agriculture in California as people migrated?
Thank you, Joel. And I did not see a heavy presence of African Americans fleeing the South. One of the more interesting things was Chinese laborers in particular would shift from mining and railroad work over to farming. Agricultural labor was, it could be fairly lucrative. If you were on a thresher crew, that could earn you $2 to $3 a day if you were just a laborer. Of course, that was competitive, but we do see a lot of Chinese workers in particular moving over. The big thing I noticed with particularly Mexican workers and treaty citizens in particular was more of a struggle over land, particularly after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would guarantee land grants, but there was a lot of conflicting claims between them, American settlers, and especially when we get to the Homestead Act and trying to protect squatter rights. The Land Act kind of tries to mitigate that, saying, hey, we're going to put it through the courts now. The problem with that is it required a big investment. It very much benefited the wealthy. And at the same time, if you were a treaty citizen, you also had to pay for a translator. And they were in very low supply in Northern California. I did not see as much evidence of them becoming laborers as much as I did seeing them being forced off of the land.
Appreciate that question. I actually have a question for you, Tyler. I know you focus mainly on the rivers in the Central Valley. I was just curious on how the mining and agriculture affected the lakes. I'm from Folsom, so Folsom Lake is a huge go-to spot, and I know right now basically dried up. So I was just curious.
Oh, another interesting one, because a lot of these lakes were created as a result. A lot of those dams going up were as a result of flooding. That is the major purpose of dams, to prevent floods in high rain years, or when the ground is less able to soak up that excess water, or especially heavy snows. So a lot of those dams were put up as a direct result of flooding to try to control it. And that's where we get, I'm from Modesto, and I spent a lot of time up in Sonora growing up. So, and from California, familiar with Pinecrest.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of those big examples of, especially up in the Sierra Nevadas, those man-made lakes that are meant to prevent flooding downstream. This was very much about their creation. Of course, there's also the fact that as we're bursting away from these mines, a lot of that is disrupting. You're destroying a lot of landscape that would hold on to the snow. We're building up a lot of mining towns that is further clearing it, and that has a lot to affect the snowpack. And since a lot of those towns are still there and have been expanded on to some degree, that has very much affected how much those rivers fill up. If the snowpack is not deep, we get lower lake levels.
Thank you very much, Tyler. I appreciate that. Is there any other questions for Tyler on his presentation? All right. Thank you very much, Tyler, for your presentation. Give it up for him one more time. All right. I will now open the floor for questions for Anna in her presentation. Or Anna, my bad. Yes, Joshua, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is as much a question as a comment. You mentioned department stores, or sorry, you mentioned fast fashion, and that having its roots in ready-made fashion. And I find it interesting that department stores that seem to be at the head of ready-made fashion are all of a sudden losing out to fast fashion. Is it that they really didn't see that coming, or is there something more at play there?
I feel like that just has to do a little bit more with like online shopping and how accessible that is, how we can basically buy anything at the touch of our hands because of our cell phones or our computers or anything. We just log on to like any website, and like Amazon, or I know a lot of people buy from Shein or anything like that that's really inexpensive, and you can get it basically like within a few days and try it on at the comfort of your own home without having to leave. And I think it just goes back to how accessible it is and how you don't have to go anywhere else.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Josh. Dylan.
Hey, Anna. Yeah, no, I was just listening to your presentation. I guess I was thinking, it sounded like fashion served mostly as like a form or like a vehicle for social conformity. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that versus like maybe fashion as like an individual. Like now when I think of fashion, it's about expressing individualism. Even if you are conforming, people think of it as like, no, I'm different. I'm expressing myself. And so I was wondering maybe you could talk about that, or maybe if that varied between classes, whereas the upper class, it was more of an expression of individuality. And then for lower classes, it was more conformity, just kind of trying to express themselves in a certain pecking order of the social status.
I think it just all goes back to like kind of conforming to like something, conforming to something, especially for like upper class women, where I'd mentioned earlier that it was a competition. People just wanted to like compete and do better and be better, seem like they have more money to be able to afford all these crazy extravagant dresses that some people wouldn't be able to afford. So it's really just like like a lot for like higher upper class women who have money, which we could kind of still see that today with a lot of people who have money, how they buy all these trendy things in order to just really seem like they're ahead of the game, and everyone else is just kind of left behind trying to follow and quickly follow along. And like I said, like today, it could also kind of be the same thing where people who don't have as much money just want to follow those trends, and they do make their own modifications in order to seem like it's a little bit individual, but at the end of the day, we all basically are wearing the same thing, and to a certain extent. Thank you.
Good question, Dylan. Appreciate it. Joel, you had a question?
Yeah, I think about the title of your presentation about femininity, and one thing that comes to mind are the dandies of the 1920s and how non-gender conforming kind of played a role in associating fashion and using that almost as a tool of resistance. Did you see any other forms of resistance in fashion in that way in your research?
Off the top of my head, not that I could really remember. I mean, yeah, no, not that I could remember, but I mean, kind of looking into like the sort of post-war and during World War I era fashion, it kind of is a little bit more not as feminine and tackles or goes into a little bit more of like male fashion in a way.
Thank you for that question. I actually have a question as well for you. You had talked about fast fashion at the end of your presentation, and then through this research, and I don't know if you can predict this or not, but what do you feel will be the next like trend that comes in for fashion? Because it seems like before, during World War II era, wartime era fashion, it was kind of like it still changed a lot, but in today's day and age, fashion changes at the drop of a dime. So what do you think will supersede fast fashion?
So I personally think that we're going to really be suffering the consequences of fast fashion. It's going to come to a point where these designers or these stores, they can't catch up in order to like really meet the trend because it's moving so quickly. I mean, I don't know if you guys like when you guys go to any stores like Target, I work at Target, so I constantly see like the different clothing changing every day. And it's just so hard to really kind of keep up with the trend that's constantly moving and constantly going at like 100 miles per hour. Something that could be popular today is not popular within like a week from now or a month from now. Yeah, it's just gonna we're just gonna be suffering the consequences of fast fashion and kind of start maybe adapting more to like thrifting, even though I know that's really popular right now, but maybe kind of like going a little bit more headstrong into that area.
Cool, thank you. Joshua, you have another question?
Yeah, that was interesting to bounce off of your question a bit in your answer, Anna. Going forward, I mean, looking at the World War I, when fashion kind of got brought back in a little bit and was a bit more tame, do you think going forward with any number of crises we have, but in terms of not having resources, do you think fashion will start to do the same thing again and start to get more simple just based off of a resource crisis?
I think so. I know like right now amongst like the youth, like I know I see people when I'm going to work or when I'm going anywhere and I pass by the high schools or the middle schools, I'll see these kids in like bright colors. And I think that's kind of a little bit of a mirror of those extravagant hats and scarves and everything. Not so much with the color, but as the color from before, but like the color now where we have all these bright pieces. And I feel like maybe when the next fashion cycle happens, we're going to see a little bit more neutral colors, a little bit more tamed, calm down, not super bright and out there pieces.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question. Does anybody else have a question? Yes, Esmeralda.
Yes, was there like a particular decade that really stood out to you that really like that you really learned a lot from like from the fashion, like of the history that it was going through. Like I remember, for example, for myself, I remember growing up, I really liked the 1940s fashion of women, but I also think it really correlated and connected to like my interest in like World War II, and also how there was a lot of like, it was really expensive, and a lot of the clothing had to be, because of the war, like a lot of women had to shift their fashion dramatically, and pants became really in fashion, and you see like female workers in the factories, and because of the men are like at war at that time.
Well, for me, one of my favorite like fashion eras is the Regency. I really love those dresses. Those are some of my favorite ones. I wish I could wear one of those and pull it off, like how they do in Bridgerton, even though they're not historically accurate. Also, yeah, like that's one of my favorite ones. I really like all those. I think they're really pretty, really, really feminine, and yeah, really like those.
Thank you for that question. Does anyone else have any questions? Well, if that is the case, then I want to just thank everybody for coming and joining this first ever conference by Perspectives titled Love, Land, and Leisure. And the last thing I'd like to do is invite everybody here to come to the Perspectives Volume 49 launch event on May 21st from 12 to 3 in Library B 131. Food and beverages will be provided. And once again, thank you so much for coming.
Really awesome job. Thank you so much. And as I just put into chat, let's meet in our regular Zoom link in about